Do they know? Okay. All right, welcome everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got quite a bit to get through in the next 3 days, as Steve had mentioned to you. We're going to start with some general introduction, walk you through what we're going to be doing for the next couple of days, talk a little bit about the solution and how this process is going to go forward. Before we really get into that, though, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on what you're going to be seeing and what's been happening behind the scenes for the last 8 months as this came together. Although the solution that we're building is not overly complex, there's a lot of moving parts to it, and it took a lot of time and effort to get this done. So for those of you who haven't spoken at a conference before, typically you have your own set of topics, you work on your own slide decks, you do your own code and your own demos, and you're not really bothered with what anybody else is doing. And if you've been doing it a long time, you typically don't do any of that until the plane ride on the way to the conference. This time was a little bit different. We had to have everything working and functional. We had people from at least 6 or 7 different time zones working on this, trying to coordinate this project for the last 8 months. It has been a tremendous amount of effort that hopefully you will appreciate as we go through this this week. We're going to try and take you through a storyline from beginning to end. And work in as much of a real-world process as we possibly can. So for those of you who work in dev teams, this should be a pretty familiar process to you, especially if you're a dev lead, about the way we have to conceptualize all this stuff and bring it to fruition and all the steps we have to take along the way. We'll try and give you as much benefit of our real-world experience as we can of the things that we see day to day happening out there in SharePoint development. This is an interactive process. Although we do have a relatively tight time schedule, we do welcome your questions throughout the process, and in some stages, especially this afternoon, as we're going deep into the feature coding and whatnot, we want you to participate. We want you to ask us, why did you do that? Why did you make this decision? Why does that work this way? And so we want that to be very interactive. We're going to start with introductions this morning of all the people who are on the team. Some of the names, or most of the names, you should be familiar with. And if you're not, this will give you a good chance to meet them for the first time. Here's our agenda. We'll do some introductions. We'll talk about what's going to happen this week and how it's going to go. We're going to go through some requirements gathering and specification early on and talk through how that process works. And then we'll take that into our next session. And so each one will build on the one before it till we reach a final solution at the end of the 3 days. So there is somebody missing from our dev team this morning who was either too tired or too hungover to make it and does not know that I'm calling him. Let's see if he answers his phone.
This long-distance provider's network is not authorized. 800-645.
Bogus. Call him. This could not end well. Is that on speaker?
It's dialing on speaker. Has to go to the States and back.
It's a long trip. God only knows what he's going to say when he picks it up.
We'll just have to introduce him ourselves.
He dodged a bullet on that one. And he probably knows it. All right, AC couldn't be here this morning. Most of you know who Andrew Connell is, of course. Critical Path Training, he and Ted Patterson's group out of Florida, talks all over the world, primarily on development. Most of you know him from WCM. He's been a SharePoint MVP for Lord only knows how long, at least 7 or 8 cycles. So he'll be pitching in a little bit later this afternoon after lunch, I guess after he recovers and wakes up. He'll be joining us this afternoon, and everybody please feel free to laugh at him when he walks in the room. Next person up, my friend and colleague Ben Robb.
Hi, so I'm Ben Robb. I've been a SharePoint MVP for 5 years, spoken at the last 3, so this is the 4th one of these conferences in London. Also speak around the world. Work for Deloitte as a senior manager on their global rollout of SharePoint.
Well, there's me. Because you recognize the guy with the hat. I'm hard to pick out in the crowd. I really blend in here in London. Hard to see. Eric Shupps, SharePoint MVP. All of our contact information is on these decks, and you can download them if you need to get a hold of us. And so I see a lot of familiar faces. You all have seen me here before. You're used to my really weird accent and my amazing ability to combine English phrases with redneck phrases, which really drives my friends crazy and makes me interesting at the pub later. Matt McDermott.
Hi, I'm Matt McDermott. This is my second conference here in London. I also speak around the world about SharePoint and things like that. You can find me at my blog, enableblue.com/blog, or on Twitter at @MatthewMcD, or you can do SharePointDog.com, and it'll all redirect back to me.
Mirjam.
Hi, my name is Mirjam van Olst. I'm from the Netherlands. This is my third year as a SharePoint MVP and my third year here as well. I organized the Dutch user group, so the DWUG. We have magazines printed that we hand out here as well, so make sure you get your copy. I don't want to take them back home because it's very heavy. I'm a Microsoft Certified Master in SharePoint 2007 and SharePoint 2010, and I work for Avanade in the Netherlands.
Mr. Schäflein.
I'm Paul Schäflein from Chicago. This is my second time here thanks to the Ash Cloud, but I'm happy to be here. I'm an independent consultant, developer, and nothing fancy for me to do. Sweet potatoes from us Midwestern guys.
Todd.
I didn't understand any of that.
Yeah, I know. I'll translate it for you later.
Except for the meat and potatoes part.
Oh, okay.
So I'm Todd Carter. I'm one of actually 3 Texans here on the dev track, which is we're well represented. I'm a SharePoint master. I'm also a instructor. So I wrote a couple of the questions. So that would you probably guess. My friends know why I'm certified then. And I speak really only 2 conferences. This one I speak to every year in the SharePoint conference. So it's a very I get to handpick the conferences I go to. And this is extremely a good conference to be at.
Reed, wife doesn't let him travel. Waldeck.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lucas. I'm a SharePoint consultant at Convention in the Netherlands. I've been SharePoint MVP for 4 seasons now, and I have a blog where I write about development and WCM.
Every day.
Yes. I haven't blogged since a month, thanks to this one. So for everything, there's a reason, right?
I think that goes for all of us. Victor!
Last but not least.
Victor Mirjam from Sweden, SharePoint Solution Architect, MVP, 3 cycles, and Certified Master for SharePoint 2010, and Certified Architect for SharePoint 2010.
One of very few. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Mirjam, who's going to talk you through some initial parts of the solution. Then Ben will talk you through some of the business stuff, and then I will come back and talk to you about requirements. So Mirjam, take it away.
Cool, thank you. So we already talked about the idea behind this conference, so I'll go into that a little bit more. What we will be doing this week is we will build a complete solution, basically from the beginning till the end, and each session will build on top of what was done in the previous session. So that we will change flavors a couple of times, so there will be a couple of changes made to the solutions in the meantime, apart from just adding stuff onto it, to make sure that everything keeps working. We will move away from the old style sessions and demos where we will just show one little feature in one session and go real deep into that. What we will be doing this week is show the whole process and show everything you will run into when you're working on a development project with SharePoint. The approach that we did is all speakers had to conform to a single solution and to a single approach, which meant obviously that some concessions had to be made. People had to adapt to each other. Yeah, so not everyone agrees on all the choices that we make, but we had to align so that we can work in a single solution. We will try to discuss as many of the choices that we made as possible. If you have any questions about whether we're doing something in one way and not in another way, please feel free to ask us. Without a doubt, there's one of the speakers that fully agrees with you that it should have been done in another way. Some of the constraints that we were working with, everything needs to be packaged for automated deployments. We will be handing over code to the IT Pro track later this week so they can deploy it onto the production farm, because they will be building the production farm during this week. Everything has to pass SP dispose check to make sure that it works and that we're not having any memory leaks in there. We will all use the same project template, even though we didn't agree on that either. Oh, look who's there. Hi, AC, good morning.
You missed my call.
No, I got it.
And whatever we're building should be deployable anywhere, wherever possible, which means that wherever possible, we will building so it can be deployed in a sandbox solution. We will try to stick to that today. Tomorrow we will kind of walk away from that because it will limit us quite a bit, obviously, if we want to keep that up. This is the production infrastructure. You're not to talk about that with the IT Pro guys because they don't know yet. They will be building this during the week. So we have one domain controller. We have 2 SQL servers, and we have 6 SharePoint servers, 2 of which are web servers, so they actually serve the websites to us. We have 2 application servers that run most of the service applications on there. Most of the services are running on these. And we have 2 search servers, or we don't have them yet, but we will have them at the end of the week, hopefully, if they're doing their job well. This is the logical infrastructure. I know you can't read it, but this is central administration, which is running in a separate application pool, obviously running under the farm account. We have the intranet here, which is running in the SP content, under the SP content application pool account. And then we have 2 other ones. We have the My Sites and the Team Sites web applications. Both of them are running in the SP Colab application pool. We'll mostly be using the intranet for our development in here. And a couple of service applications that we will be using on the dev track. We have the BCS service application, the Business Data Connectivity service application. We have managed metadata, search, user profiles, and word automation. So you will see all of these being used in the development project. This is our development infrastructure. It's actually bigger than this, but we are not using all of it. We have a DC as well. We have a build server, because we'll be showing you automated builds and how that should work to optimize your development cycles. We have TFS. This is the most used server of the bunch, because we all had to work on the same code base and make sure that we checked everything in, so we all use the same code, and we sync everything up. We have our development server. So our development environment is a single server SharePoint box. So it's not very similar to our production environment, but in most cases, your development environment will be a single box. In this case, the whole team, so all 9 of us, are working on the same development server, the same VM. In a normal project, you would never do that because it doesn't work. Whenever one of us wants to work on there and tries to log on, we always get the message, someone's logged on. Do you want to log this person out?
Yes.
Probably.
Being the westernmost time zone was helpful in that regard.
Yeah, the different time zones were definitely helpful there. So normally, you would use a VM per developer. You can develop on your laptop if you want to, but you would use a VM on there as well. So suppose you work on 4 different projects or 3 different projects, and you work in a single VM. So you deploy all your code into that same VM. You will get all the solutions for all the projects into a single VM. It's a lot more organized if you have a separate VM for each project. Obviously, if you want to use automated builds, you will probably have them somewhere in the cloud and organized. But have a VM for each developer. Don't try to get developers to share VMs. It doesn't really work. A SQL server for the development environment as well. We have our test environment, because obviously we're not allowed to hand over our solution to the IT pros without actually testing it on our test environment. Because
that is test when we hand it to the IT pro.
Yeah. So SPDev is our own box. So it works on my machine, means it works on SPDev, right? So it will work there. Question is, does it work on SPTest as well? In this case, SPTest is a single server. You might want to get your test environment to look a little bit more like your production environment, but it definitely needs to be a separate environment so you can also test your deployment. So your solution might work if you build it from Visual Studio, but does it work if you deploy it with just a WSP? And obviously, test environment has its own SQL environment as well. That's important as well, so that split out your SQL environment for dev and test and quality assurance across the different environments to make sure that you don't clash anywhere or that you don't get things fixed on your development environment, have more permissions on your development environment, maybe on the SQL box. So make sure you mimic your production environment as well as possible so your test actually means something. Ben.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk for a bit about some of the business side of developing. So who should be in your team? How do you manage change? How do you manage that relationship with the business? Because ultimately your business is going to drive the functionality that they want to have appear in your solution. So there's really, it's a bit arbitrary to talk about it in this session, but there's not really any other session where it's appropriate to talk about it. So we're covering that here. So in your team, we would always expect to see a project manager to, keep you on track, make sure you're meeting the requirements, make sure you're doing that in a timely manner, and reporting back to management about how all that, how your project's going. You should always have an architect, and that should be someone who's at a senior level, who's not necessarily going to code the solution, though in smaller projects they may do some coding as well. But they need to have a deep understanding not just of the development side, but also the IT pro side. They need to be able to really understand the framework that you're developing in and how that's going to actually play out in the real world when you deploy it to your production servers. And really, the architect provides that glue between the IT pro side of the business, the operations teams, and the development teams. So then the next main role, and these other roles you probably only have one or maybe two people in any given project. Developers, you can have as many developers as you can afford.
As your project manager can manage.
As your project manager can manage. Yeah. The mythical man month says if you have 10 developers, they're not going to produce the same as in 1 month as one developer in 10 months, right? So you get diminishing returns the more developers you have, because there's a management overhead from a project management perspective, but also from a lead developer perspective as well. Having someone who's going to check all your developers' code and make sure it's been done right, it's conforming to the overall structure. It's much harder to do that as your team grows. And so being able to break up your project into mini projects of discrete chunks of work will make it much easier for your project managers to do that successfully. You do need a business analyst, and in smaller projects, you might find that the PM or architect will take this role, but you need someone whose defined role is doing business analysis and really talking to the business and really digging down and understanding exactly what it is that you're trying to build, why you're trying to build it, what the business value is, how that goes through and gets through to the code that your developers actually start writing. And that person, it depends on the type of project. If you're doing an intranet project, if you're doing a project which has a lot of user interface design work that's going to happen, you're going to probably need an information architect to really make sure that the user journey through your solution is solid, that people can find the information easily through navigation, that it's consistent and coherent to those users. And that person will also work very closely with a UI designer, a graphic designer, to actually build your designs for your systems. Quite often, those last two bullet points are completely missed from dev projects. And they will, if you miss those roles from your project team, your project will probably fail. You'll deliver, on time, to budget, but your users will never use it. They'll hate it. So it's really important to make sure that you do have these people involved in your team, right? These are the people that should be going to your development Scrum meetings. You know, every day, every week, they should be attending those meetings and playing the advocate of the business. You know, being the person who is effectively the client in the relationship. You probably won't find that you can get the real business people, the real business owners in the room very often. They're busy doing business stuff. So these two people are the people who are going to be the voice of those people in the room. So then looking a bit wider out of your immediate development team, there's also almost certainly the need for a project board that's going to drive the overall strategy behind your deployment. You're going to need an executive sponsor. Without an executive sponsor, you're very unlikely to get the budgets that you need to deliver. You're not going to be able to effect the change through the business that you're probably going to need to do in order to deploy your intranet or your application, whatever you're building. So it's very important to have that executive level, you know, CIO, CFO, you know, whoever it is. They need to be at a very senior level within the organization. They need to have sufficient budget and power to drive that through. Ideally, with big strategic projects, you want the CEO to be actively involved. And certainly, if you can get your project onto their management reporting for the board, you know, that's going to drive it's going to remove a lot of roadblocks for you. You also need to make sure that you've properly engaged with the operations team. So you develop your solution, you chuck it over the wall to the IT pros, and they go, we haven't got service for this. Why did no one talk to us? So it's really important to make sure they're involved through this process. And similarly for enterprise architects. In larger organizations, you're going to have an enterprise architect who really sees the big picture about how all of the servers are communicating, what all the internal structures are. You also absolutely need representation from the business. So if you're building an HR system, you need users from HR to be actually involved in the project, in the definition, in the ongoing support as part of your project board. And then finally, support, IT support. You know, when something goes wrong, users will pick up the phone and ring up IT support. They need to be involved early enough in the process so that they're aware of the project coming through, what the implications are for their team, so they can get ramped up before the users start calling them. IT support guys really hate being called to support an application that they know nothing about, that they've never been informed about. They get really irritated by that. So how do you deal with that kind of change in a holistic approach? You need to think about change right from the start, and this is why I'm talking about it in this first session. You need to have a process in your organization that's going to be able to manage that change through the business, and not just from an IT perspective, but also from a business perspective. How do you do communications? How do you drive the business to use your application? So you need all the people I've talked about in the roles and responsibility to be involved in this change advisory board. You need business owners and process owners so that they can set priorities, because you will not be able to do everything at the same time. And you need the IT ops people to be able to say what the impact is going to be, and you know, whether or not downtime on that application is going to be acceptable. And so when you're thinking about the process that you have to do that you have to go through in order to deal with that change efficiently, there's a number of gates that you should think about instituting in your organizations. So starting off with the first one, where the business is saying, I need something new. I need to make a change to an existing application, or I need to put a new application in. So I'm not sure. Yeah, you should be able to see this. So at that stage, you want your devs and your IT ops people to be looking at that change and saying, yeah, we're happy. This is going to. We understand the impact of that from an IT perspective, and this is a viable solution, fits in with our overall enterprise strategy for what we're doing. And at that point, technology or a third party will build the solution. So it's important to do the validation before you start build. Now, in the real world, that happens everywhere, right? Most organizations, technology will find out, particularly the ops people will find out, 3 months after dev started that this project is coming on, and they don't get the opportunity to validate that up front. But if you can, as much as possible, validate up front, it's very useful. So once the development's done, either in-house or outsourced, you get a formal submission to your change advisory process. And that traditionally would just be a lump of code, maybe a document to accompany it to say how to install it if you're lucky. But in a best practice scenario, what you want to be mandating at that stage, where people are actually giving you code to deploy, is obviously the code needs to come to you. You need deployment scripts. Back to what Eric was saying, or Mirjam was saying earlier about automating everything is the key to really having efficient processes to move things to production. Having test cases well documented, ideally automated, but that's a lot of work. But at the least, they should be well documented. They should be clear, concise test cases that can be run, and documentation needs to be up to date. So your functional specification needs to be right. You need to be able to make sure that the process is well understood by everyone. So once you've done that, you go into a testing process. And to do this properly, what you need is some degree of automation and some degree of manual review. So you want to automate as many of the test cases as you can, make it so that you can just run those again and again and again. So the next time you get a deployment, you don't have to manually process all those tests. But you will also want to do a manual code review, because running SP dispose check, running FX cop, doing those automated code reviews, that's fine, but there's no substitute for a skilled individual having a look at some code and identifying potential issues. You also want to automate your performance tests. And for that, what you traditionally need is a separate environment that's specifically for performance tests, and that should be as close as you can possibly get it to a production environment. Once you've done your performance tests, you then need to benchmark it. So you can then understand what the impact of changes, whether that's config change or code changes. So being in a situation where you can say, this was our performance before we deployed it, this is our performance now, that gap is okay, or that gap is not acceptable. That's going to impact end users. Without that benchmark, you don't know what those numbers actually mean. So once all of that's done, and you've passed all the testing, you then have a formal approval meeting with the change advisory board. And that basically authorizes the deployment to potentially a user acceptance test environment for your end users, to your business owners to to sign off that they're happy that the requirements have been met, and then move to deploy to production. In many cases, people stop there and they think, we're done, we're finished, they have a party, they have a drink. Actually, you then need to come back and make sure you've got time in your project and budget in your project to come back and refactor those tests. So you need to redo your benchmarks for your performance testing. You probably need to update your smoke tests to make sure that the new functionality is covered by this change that's come through. And you need to make sure all your internal documentation around the solution is up to date. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Eric, who's going to talk about the actual solution that we're building.
All right, so I know what some of you are thinking. Blah, 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 blah. I'm a developer. This is my problem. Show me some code. Right? Question. How many of you are consultants or work for a consulting company? Let me see the hands. Okay. Put them down. When you go into a client, who becomes their SharePoint expert? You or somebody they have in-house? Hands up for it becomes you. Exactly. Let me tell you a story about why this stuff is important. Did a big public website for an educational customer in the US. And they came to us, tell me if this sounds a little bit familiar. They came to us and said, we have to stand up this website. We had somebody already involved who messed it up. We now need you to come in and fix it and make it right. It needs to be done in 6 weeks, and we have no specification. Have we heard that before? Here's a set of features we would like you to build for us. Can you do that in 6 weeks? Well, consultants, much like attorneys, the only answer is, of course. We'll be happy to do that for you for a nice big round number. And we did. And we deployed it on time and on budget. Problem. When we got there, we didn't know where the finish line was. We just had a bucket of stuff that needed to work. That was a 3-month initiative. Over the next 9 months, we redid everything we built in those first 3 months. It cost them 3 times as much money to do the project the right way than it would have if they had just done it the right way in the first place. Would they have made their date? Nope. But they would have saved themselves hundreds of thousands of dollars if they had gone through this process in the first place. Problem number 2. When we did decide that we needed to rewrite this whole thing because the decisions we made up front were just to get it working, we were dealing with an IT manager who was standing between the development team and the business. Neither the business nor IT knew diddly squat about SharePoint. So the business was talking in meetings sort of to the IT manager. They didn't really talk to each other because, politics get in the way and, they can't have direct discussions. So the IT manager was translating the business requirements to me, and I had to turn around and give him an answer of how are we going to do this in SharePoint, which went back through him and back to the business. Does this sound like a good functional process? It wasn't. Did they get what they wanted? Nope, not even close. Until I finally said, enough's enough. We can't do this anymore. You're throwing money down the drain. We have to stop and fix this problem and refactor this whole process. So we took 3 months out of the development cycle and went back to identifying roles and responsibilities, a change management process, features and requirements gathering to build them exactly what they wanted with input from the business telling us how they wanted to see things. One of the things we didn't know is that they had to take data out of the database and actually report it to government entities about students that they were tracking. There are certain standards that are required. They forgot to mention that the database had to be compliant with these standards and their funding was dependent upon the reports. That was a small detail that they managed to overlook. So we had to go back and rewrite the entire data structure because nobody told us that up front. And their funding got held up because of it. It sounds like too much stuff, right? Do we really need to be concerned about all this requirement stuff and change management and roles and responsibilities? Yeah, we do. And when you're the expert that they're relying on, they don't know the questions to ask. You have to tell them, stop the train, Mr. Customer. We need to talk about this. Let's get this right from the beginning so we don't have to redo it. Because we all love redoing code we've already done 3 times, right? Because they changed their mind. Those are our favorite customers. Get this process right up front, do the things that Ben was talking about, and you can avoid a lot of this stuff. And I know it's not really a development problem. It doesn't have anything to do with code. It becomes your problem when you have to constantly rewrite and refactor and change code, and your whole code base becomes brittle. Okay, so let's talk about what we're going to be doing specifically this week. Interestingly enough, when Steve suckered us into, got our agreement to do this, we didn't have any idea what we were going to build. We knew what he wanted, much like a typical customer. He gave us a very vague picture and said, now go do something. Typical IT pro. We didn't know what we were going to do. So we had to sit down and figure out, what do we want to build that can actually show some value, that's real world, that we can deliver to the folks at the conference. So Spence and Mirjam and I sat down in Stockholm last November? Last November. And we threw some things up against the wall and said, what can we build? Out of that process came a document that we'll actually show you that document when we do the feature coding this afternoon, that became our requirement specification. And as we brought people into the team, people added to the requirement specification, we fleshed it out, and we ended up with a solution. So we had ended up with 9 developers on the team. We all had to play different roles. Mirjam and I played the project management role. Paul and Andrew and some of the other folks played the hands-on coding developer role. We had the test. Todd and I are doing the testing piece. We all had to play the different roles in the team to make this happen. What was interesting is that even though it was a whole bunch of devs who know this stuff down cold, we ended up falling into some of the same patterns that you see in your development cycle, i.e., we couldn't get anybody to update the requirements document on time when we needed it for a deadline, including ourselves. We couldn't get anybody to agree on the final deliverable. We had to have lots of entertaining discussions, none of which are family-friendly, around what are we going to do with this piece or that piece or the other piece, and how is this going to work? And, oh, by the way, has anybody really tested this? Is this going to work? So we followed that same process. What we came up with as a concept for what we're going to build this week is a knowledge base solution in SharePoint. Like any knowledge base, it has some basic functional requirements. You need to be able to create, edit, modify, delete articles. You need to be able to summarize those articles and sort and filter and do some searching around that article content. They need to follow a structured format so that they're always displayed the same, much like you see on an MSDN article. In fact, that's kind of the template that we followed. We need to have a way to relate them to each other so that knowledge-based articles on same or similar topics can be located and are easily available to you. They needed to be searchable. They needed to be tied into the SharePoint search infrastructure. So if we put in a keyword on something and you happen to be an expert for that keyword, we need to be able to find you in the organization. We also needed to go out and get external content. What things out there relate to the knowledge base article that we're creating, and how can we tie those pieces together? So as we talked through how this thing was going to work, we started to boil down these specifications. And there's a couple things we realized we probably needed as well. Not everybody is online reading KBs all the time. Some people still like to print things out for whatever reason. They're just old school and they like to have a piece of paper in their hands that they can read or take it on the train or whatever it is that they do. So we needed to have a way to turn SharePoint list items, not documents, but list items into documents that were then exportable, preferably via PDF. And so on and so forth. So this is what it boiled down to, and we'll dig into the guts of this solution this afternoon and how it was built. But this is what we came up with as our requirements document for what we're going to build. over the next couple days, we're going to take you through this entire process of build, test, and all that, all the various functional components. And then at the end, when all of this is said and done, everything that you see here, or almost everything that you see here in the next 3 days, is going to become a CodePlex solution that we will publish out there for you to use and take and run with it. Right? So lots of nice free code that you can take off with. If the code is bad, blame Paul. Okay. So, once we had the basic idea of what we were going to build, we then had to figure out what are the SharePoint-y bits that we're going to have to include to make this happen. So how many of us in here are dev team leads or senior developers? Oh, a whole bunch of chiefs and no Indians in the room. Fantastic.
Yeah, we had that problem.
Just like our team. Okay, so a big part of your job as a dev lead is not so much cranking out the actual code as it is figuring out who's supposed to do what and how is this solution supposed to look. So when I'm given a set of requirements that says I want to create a knowledge-based solution and I have to have articles and this stuff, I can see the wheels spinning in some of your mind sitting around here thinking, okay, he wants to have an article, we're going to use SharePoint list forms for that, we're going to store it in a list, right? We may use approvals and publishing, and so you're already thinking along those lines. That was always in question during this whole process. Paul makes a very good point. You have to consider who you have and what their capabilities are. Are they new SharePoint folks? Can you tell someone on your team, give me a web part, and they'll be able to determine should this be a visual web part or a classic web part? How many features do they want for this? What way is this going to be activated and how is it going to be deployed? Or are they newbies and you have to tell them every little piece? Do you have to design the solution and then say, okay, you plug your code in here, right? That's a big part of the process. You have to figure out what artifacts are going to go into the solution, how they're grouped and put together and activated and deployed. So these are the basic functional artifacts that we came up with. Article summary, details, create, revise, update, delete. Related content, which is other KB articles that relate to the one we're at on a keyword basis or category basis. Related external content, which we're getting from an external database. We have our Find an Expert, which is our people search component. There's also the related content internal is also a search component, and an offline PDF. So this is how we mapped these together. The article summary and article details became web parts. The article CRUD, we decided to use the built-in list forms for these. Related content is keyword search, external is BCS, Find an Expert is people search, and the offline content is OpenXML and Word automation services. Okay? So these are the various pieces and components that we're going to be building for the next 3 days to make all this go together. Now, we mentioned earlier, Mirjam mentioned that some of these decisions that we made are somewhat arbitrary. Some of them have very specific purposes, and we're going to talk you through why we made some of the decisions that we made. But some things come up quite naturally in the discussion. You might be asking yourself right now, why did you decide to use web parts instead of publishing pages, for example, to create your articles? There was discussion about that. There are reasons we decided not to do that, primarily because not everybody that is going to use this solution has a server license. They may only have a foundation license. They may also be on Office 365 or in a lockdown, tightly controlled, sandboxed environment, so they wouldn't be able to do that. The publishing infrastructure also has some limitations around the library you can put things in and things of that nature. So we made some decisions along the path, such as using web parts over publishing pages, that guided how this solution was going to be built. These are the same day-to-day decisions that you have to make as a dev lead in your team. The BA doesn't care. They have no idea how you're going to build this, and if you told them it was going to be a Wazoo Hula Got It widget, they'd go, okay, just make it work, right? So they don't care, but you care. And you have to think long-term, how is this code going to be maintained? Am I always going to be in an on-prem environment? At some point, am I going to be in cloud environment? How am I going to do all this stuff? Will it upgrade? What's the next version look like? All these decisions that we have to make going forward. Then we have to think about, okay, we're creating this solution, but we also have to have a deployment strategy. How are we going to take this forward? How are we going to get it built? Do we live in an ALM environment inside our enterprise? Hopefully you do. where you have nightly and continuous builds, or are you in sort of more of a loosey-goosey ad hoc environment? You are the dev team, right? So none of this stuff really matters. The automated builds are when you press F5, right? If you're not, though, and you're in a continuous build environment, you got to think through this stuff. Who's going to do what? How are they going to publish? Do I have gated check-ins, right? Who's responsible for making sure? Do we have unit tests that have to run or integration tests before the code can be checked in? How does it go to the build servers? Who's responsible for all that stuff? What does the environment look like? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Decisions that you have to make. Deployable assets. We just chose, you may not necessarily make the same decision, but we chose to build some web templates to package this stuff together and be able to deliver it as a unit that you could take and say, I want to create a new knowledge base article site, for example, and it would automatically deploy all the assets and all the piece parts for you. Pretty powerful stuff. We wanted to show you how that works in conjunction with our core solution, so we decided to build in some web templates to bring all that stuff together for you. You may not decide to do this in your environment, but at some point you do have to ask yourself, how is this going to be used by the enterprise? Do we have one site collection, or do we have 1,000 site collections? Are people just going to activate these features one by one, or do we need to give them a magic button that they push to make everything happen? Do we have to have something where they pick the type of site that they're after in order for them to get what they want all packaged together and delivered? Those are dev lead decisions that have to be made in building your solution, and they're the same things that we talked about here. We had all these discussions. Should we do it this way? Should we do it that way? How should we bring all this stuff together and make it happen? And when we do decide certain paths, like, for example, web templates, what are the repercussions of that? Where will it work, and where won't it work, right? So the big decision point here is what? Site definitions versus web templates if you're going to do package deployment, right? Why would you do one versus the other? What kind of environment are you in? Are you in 2007 or 2010? Hopefully you all are in 2010, but some of you may be in legacy environments in 2007. Web templates aren't an option for you. You may have to drop back to using a site definition approach and understand the repercussions of doing that in your environment, having to maintain that long term. Including the MMS and BCS. So let's talk about the BCS piece for just a moment. We can, and in some cases it may make more sense, to go retrieve external data via just a no-data connection or a data access library or some ADO.NET, whatever you use in your enterprise, or if it's an Oracle source or something like that, you may have to have some client connector that you have to use to get the data. However, there's some really good reasons why you would want to use a BCS in this type of scenario, and probably some really good reasons why you wouldn't want to use the BCS in this scenario. We use the BCS in this scenario for a couple of reasons. One, because it created what I like to call a universal data library. When you create BCS models and you publish them, anybody can use that in their code. All they have to do is call the model. It's like having that universal data DLL that gets to everything that you want to get to. They're deployable, they're securable, they're very manageable. And once you publish the models, if you need to add functionality, you add it to the model and republish the model. Everybody can use it. Very beneficial. Also, it can be used online, whereas your custom components that access data may not be usable online. If, for example, you're in the sandbox, the only way to call an external web service is via the BCS. So we made a decision that we would include BCS functionality in this solution. You may disagree with that. We had some of our own internal disagreements on that subject. It does introduce a lot of complexity. Okay? BCS is not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of moving parts that you have to master to make it work, and you have to take into account permissions and the secure store and all that stuff that has to happen. Another decision that we made is categorization of articles. How are we going to do this? Do we want to just use ad hoc data in a list, a choice field? People type some stuff in. That's an option. Could work. You'll actually see that methodology in our core base solution. But a better approach, we think, for the enterprise is to use managed metadata, where you can control a centralized catalog for how that data should look. So that, for example, we can have categorize, properly spelled with a Z instead of an S, in our solution. In managed metadata, we can make both of those terms, right? It's your language. We just fixed it, all right? We can make both of those terms mean the same thing. If I just put them into a choice field in a category and you search for categorize, you're not going to get categorize. You're just going to get the term that I put in. Put it into manage metadata, and I can make both of those things mean the same thing. I can also handle multilingual scenarios, right? For example, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different languages here, 5 if you count redneck. So we've got to account for these different languages. Well, what if they want to put their choices in Swedish in the list? They certainly change the keyboard on me every time I turn around on the server. So odds are they're going to want to type in something in Swedish in there. How do I handle that? I'm never going to search for that term, but it means the same thing. Managed metadata gives us that capability. However, managed metadata is an enterprise-only solution. It won't work in, say, an online environment. So we made a decision to split out some of the functionality of our solution, and you'll see this as we go forward in the build. We have a base solution that covers the core aspects, and then we have some advanced solutions, the BCS and the managed metadata piece and the enterprise search, that handle the on-prem type stuff that you can do in an environment where you have that kind of full control. So we're going to try and give you the big picture of both sides of that equation, because sooner or later, you may not have dealt with it yet, sooner or later you will have to deal with the sandbox. And you will have to tell the internal or external customer, this is what will work and this is what won't work, and be able to talk intelligently to that and to make those kind of decisions. Search, here's another one. Exceptionally powerful framework. I know search is an IT pro thing. But leveraging search in your code can be exceptionally powerful. If you have a lot of data, and we'll talk about this in the performance piece, nothing is faster in data retrieval than search in the SharePoint API world. We wanted to use it for a couple different things. One, to find other articles that related to what we were the specific article we were looking at, and also to hook up experts into it. That required enterprise-level features, right? Online has some basic search, doesn't do the enterprise search stuff. So we don't have some of the taxonomic stuff that can come out of the user profiles and so forth. But we wanted to be able to include that in a solution. So that drove our multi-tiered design of a base solution with some base functionality and an advanced solution with all the other stuff that it brings together. So at the end of the day, when you get this solution, you'll be able to deploy it both in your lockdown sandbox environment and in an enterprise environment with all these other features. Word automation services. So taking a SharePoint list item and making a document out of it, not such an easy task. Unless you decide to use OpenXML and Word automation services. Anybody programmed against Word automation services in here yet? A couple of people have. Okay. Powerful framework. Most of the time we use it to just take a document, and I bet 99% of the time it's just used to convert Word to PDF, right? We're going to take it a step further and take that SharePoint list item, first create a Word document with it, and then create a PDF from the Word document. Again, an enterprise-only feature, so it's part of the advanced solution, but will allow users to download a PDF version of the article. Okay, so we're going to wrap this one a little bit earlier than we originally planned. We'll take a little bit of a break. Then we're going to come back, and Waldeck and Victor are going to take you through the first initial stuff. Yes, there will be demos. Relax. We're going to open Visual Studio, all right? Don't panic on me. So before we do that and take a little bit of a break here and get reset up so we can do our other stuff here, do we have any questions about solution design or requirements?